But why? I mean, what is it really trying to say? Okay, Frenchie?
That the South was destroyed.
Okay. Look at what you're looking at. Look at what you're looking at. Okay. It's one building, yes?
It was when after the war, and it was like that was like the South's economy after.
Yeah, it's kind of representative of what you are going to find in the South. You're going to find destruction. Now, rebuilding the South was going to be extremely difficult because when you look at this building, what is it going to take to rebuild this building? What do you do first? Mr. Guerra. Although I heard it from Andy and that was a good answer, but I want to see if you know it. What? Yeah. The first thing that you need to do is knock down whatever was there. And then do what? Yes. Create a new building, a new foundation. Now, knocking it down is going to take some time. Knocking it down is going to take some effort. It's not going to be easy. So, imagine, let's replace the building with the Southern economy. Now, how is what I just finished saying, the analogy that I just finished using in the building, similar to the Southern economy? Andy?
The analogy of knocking it down?
The analogy of the broken building and having it to break down to rebuild again.
How is it similar to the Southern economy?
Yes.
Because a lot of people lost their jobs and stuff, so they have to like start fresh.
Okay, tell me a little bit about the Southern economy before the war.
Slaves, yeah.
Okay, slaves. And it was slaves all the way because they were fighting. It was all the way until the end of the war, right? So it was slave all the way to the end of the war. The war now ends.
And they don't have anyone to work their crops.
And now, as a consequence of the war ending, that moment where there is no more war, that's the moment where slavery ends. That's the moment, and I'm not saying physically slavery ends at that moment, but that's the moment where the Southern economy is not only in bad condition because all of this fighting, if you've been following the fighting, a lot of the fighting took place not in battlefields, because there's not like parks where people say, hey, meet you at the park, let's have a battle there. It's like, it's not like a sporting event, let's go to the courts in the corner and let's have a basketball game. They were fighting all over the place, and many of the fights took place in the South. And we already said that the South's main business was what? Plantation. That means that there was a lot of plantations, right? So, much of the fight took place where? On plantations. So, not only are the plantations, a lot of them destroyed, as you see a little bit here, but now you're breaking it down even further. You're kind of leveling it, because now you're saying, not only is the plantations kind of destroyed, now we're going to take away the system that drove the plantation, and the system that drove the plantation was what? Slavery. The system that drove the plantation was slavery. So, the same thing with the building. It's in bad shape at the end of the war, but now you got to knock it down to build something new. In the same way that the building, it takes time, effort, and money to build the building. It's going to take time, effort, and money to build the new economy in the South. It can't rely on slaves anymore. But what happens? Well, I believe that the Russian premier or leader just said it. Sometimes when a spring is compressed, it has a tendency to want to do what? expand again. He said that in relations to what is currently happening in the world. He's saying, well, the Soviet Union was once very big, and then the end of the Cold War came, and it got compressed into its borders of Russia. And now it wants to expand again. Okay? And in the South, there was the sentiment, there was the feeling of, okay, the war's over, but what we know is slavery. Let's figure out how we can get back into what we know. Because you and I like to do what we know. Very few people like to do something different. Okay? For example, that's the biggest problem with sports or with dance, right? You get used to doing it one way, and somebody comes in and says, no, that's not how you do it. You do it this other way. And it takes you a long time to get used to it. Imagine shooting a basketball. Imagine shooting a basketball. You've been shooting the basketball over here like that. And it's not the best form, is that? No, but you've been getting baskets. So you get used to it because when you do the right form, you don't get baskets, but when you do it over here, you do. And somebody comes in, the coach comes in and says, no. You're doing it the wrong way. We got to do it some different way. You got to do it this way. You got to bend your knees. You got to kind of, explode into the shot. If you really want to get the distance, it's got to have the right arc. And you're like, I'm going to try. And doink, 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 doink. Now you get into a close game. You got the ball. What are you going to do? You're going to revert to over here, because that's what works. Same thing with the South. As things got tougher, they wanted to revert back to what they knew, which was slavery. Yet, the 13th Amendment didn't allow it. But you are experts at analyzing when a rule is there, right? Sometimes your parents lay down a rule. You say, okay, I can't do this way. But maybe I can do this a different way. Right? It isn't that we're evil. But we think that way, don't we? So in the South, they began to say, maybe we can't call them slaves. Maybe we can do something different. Somebody said, let's pass a law that says that everybody that lives in this state has to have a job. And if you don't have a job, you broke the law. And what happens to people that break the law? They get arrested, and they go where? To jail. Now they've lost their freedom. And while they're in jail, you can get them to do free work, can't you? That works. Nobody's hiring former slaves, right? Nobody's kind of a job wanted for former slaves. So they're not going to have jobs. Since they're not going to have jobs, they're going to be in violation of the law, right? We'll go arrest them, put them in jail, and then since they're in jail because they broke the law, we can have a period of time in which we can make them work for free. Not because they're slaves, but because they're now prisoners. Because they've broken a law. Yeah. They came up with all of these sorts of wicked ways to try to get around, because that's what they knew. That's what they understood. That was the economy that worked for them until the end of the war. I would like to say I can't blame them, except for slavery is such a bad thing. It was ingenious. Somebody had to think about it. But what happens? At the beginning of Reconstruction, the federal government really did not want anybody that had to do with the rebellion to participate in politics. You guys left. You didn't want to be in politics, right? Now we don't want you. So if you're going to run for political office, you got to guarantee that you weren't involved in that rebellion. Of course, almost every able-bodied Southerner was involved in the rebellion, except for whom? Except for whom? Get that? If all of the most of the able-bodied men in the South participated in the war, and the North now after the war says you can't run for political office, who can?
The woman.
Nope, women can't. Yes. Who? Who can now run for political office? Who didn't participate on the side of the Confederacy? Yes.
African American.
Former slaves. Now they're the ones. Think about it. One day you're a slave, the next day you're in Congress. What a world this is! Yeah. Did that make Southerners very happy?
No.
I owned this guy yesterday, and now he's my representative in Congress. Doesn't make me very happy. Actually, I wouldn't care because I wouldn't own slaves. But it didn't make them happy. So they had to come up with constructive evil. I like to say evil because sometimes when you kind of go around the rules, it's a little bit of evil, right? Yes, it is. So they had to come up with ways of going around this. And one of the things that they did is that because after slaves were free, a number of things happened. The 13th Amendment made them free, the 14th Amendment gave them citizenship, and the 15th Amendment allowed them to vote. Allowed them to vote. And we're going to explore these amendments in a more thorough and in-depth way when we get to civics in next year. But now they can vote. But I can create some difficulties in them voting. Because what I can do is I can say, okay, how can I, in a legal way, prevent these people who now have the right to vote? Well, people that vote should be educated, right? So, in order for you to vote, I am going to give you a literacy test. Could slaves pass a literacy test? But a lot of white people could pass the literacy test, right? If I administer the literacy test evenly, how many former slaves versus white people are going to be able to pass? No slaves, everybody white. So a literacy test works because now I can exclude African Americans from voting and say, hey, it's just a literacy test. I'm not saying that it's a literacy test that only African Americans can take. Everybody takes it. Another way of going around is called a poll tax. Just keep these two things in mind. The word poll, in this case, isn't something that is used to hold up a building. Look, that pole is holding up a building. And it's not where Santa lives, the North Pole. When we use poll in this case, poll tax, we're talking about a place to vote, okay? Or a voting location. And a tax is a requirement that you pay money to the government, because tax is how the government makes money. Now, what we can do is we can say everybody that wants to vote can vote. Doesn't matter whether you're African American or white American, except you gotta pay to vote. It's a tax. Now, who didn't have jobs at the end of the Civil War? Kid. Now, think that you were a former slave. Food, voting. What are you going to choose? Food. That's an interesting way of keeping people from voting, right? And you can say, if somebody says, hey, you're preventing African Americans from voting, you say, no, everybody's got to pay it. White people have to pay it. African Americans have to pay it. Except white people had jobs. Okay? They could still pay it. African Americans couldn't pay it. The last of the very interesting ways of going around the law was, okay, no poll taxes, no literacy tests. Those are terrible things. You can vote if your grandfather voted. Everybody whose grandfather was able to vote can vote. But of course, having your grandfather that was able to vote, that gives you a stake in society, that gives you an interest in society. Your grandfather was great, now your father voted, now you can vote. How many African Americans' grandfathers were able to vote? Why?